Mark Twain once said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting its shoes on. And most of us tend to have pretty straightforward views on world events. We accept the explanation we're given on things like global warming and the tragedy that was 9/11 without much question. But there are some people who refuse to accept the consensus and who have very different views indeed. So would you welcome please two of those people, musician and activist Jim Corr and the Deputy Leader of the UK Independence Party, Lord Christopher Monckton. Good evening to you both.
Hey, Ryan.
How are you?
Good to see you. How are you?
Nice to see you.
Been a while.
Now, of course, everyone will know you first and foremost as a member of the Corrs, successful musician and so forth. But in recent times, you've held what some might be considered to be alternative views on world events, if you like. So I suppose the initial interest in taking this slant on the world came from what? Was there a trigger for it?
Well, it was 9/11, and
Okay.
I got very curious as to what actually happened that day, and I had a lot of questions. And as I began to study it and kept at it, and I discovered that there was just so many anomalies.
Yeah.
That where it was obvious to me that the official story just could not be true. And I think, like, I continued on. Or recently, we've had a group of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Over 1,100 of them. Basically state that those buildings could not have come down the way that we are told. And so, an awful lot of inconsistencies, which points to it being, I believe, what they call a false flag operation.
All right. Now, for most people, the planes went into the buildings collapsed as a result of that, and desperate tragedy happened, and of course that triggered even more tragedy around the world. You say, no, it wasn't as simple as that. Is that it?
Well, you see, that there's the questions that arose with me was, how can two planes take down three buildings? Because there was three buildings that came down on the day of 9/11. World Trade Center 7 collapsed neatly into its own footprint at practically free fall speed, and no plane hit it. And we were told that the reason that it came down was due to fire, and that debris hit it. Now, when you watch the footage of it coming down, it comes down in the manner of a controlled demolition. There were 503 statements that were taken from first responders, emergency workers, police, fire department, stating that they heard multiple explosions going off in the buildings. Many of them describing that they heard these detonation charges going off in rapid sequence down the building, also describing seeing these bright orange flashes spiralling down the building. And the 9/11 Commission at the time chose completely to ignore those 503 statements. But recently, and very bravely, 60% of the 9/11 Commission members have come out and publicly stated that the investigation was a fraud and that they were hindered by the White House and that there needs to be a new investigation.
So who did it then, as you see it?
Well, there's lots of speculation as to who did it. First of all, I mean, we need to understand what false flag operations are. Most people hate war. And most of the military do not want to be at war. So how do you dupe the military and a nation and its allies to get behind an illegal war and a hugely profitable war? And that's where false flag operations come in. Basically, what you do is you stage a terrorist attack against yourself so that to be blamed on somebody else, so that you've then got that excuse to invade that other country, to dominate their natural resources.
Okay, so who did that then? Who, as you see it, who would want to do such a thing? Is it the American government? Is that it? Is it the CIA? Is it the FBI?
There's speculation that it's the shadow government that was the Anglo-American establishment, the shadow government in control of the US, and that it was ordered by them.
And who's the shadow government?
And that it was executed then by the intelligence services. I mean, we've had a former Italian president, Francesco Cossiga, has stated that he believed it was a joint operation between the CIA and Mossad. Also, former German Secretary of Defense has stated he believed it was a joint operation between the Mossad and the CIA. And
with a view to doing what?
Apparently it's common knowledge within the intelligence services that it was what they call a false flag operation.
With a view to doing what? What's the ultimate aim?
To succor the American people and their allies into another illegal, unjust war.
And who benefits from that?
War is hugely profitable, okay? Hugely profitable. So if you're able to dominate the natural resources of the country, the oil, and also the opium trade in Afghanistan, okay, there's a hugely lucrative industry there.
We have some people in the audience who will disagree with you, as I'm sure you're used to at this stage, because for obvious reasons. Before I go to Christopher Monckton, I do want to ask you about the airport scanners, which have become more prevalent in the United States. Have you an issue with those or not?
Let's stick on 9/11, and I certainly do want to talk about the economic crisis.
Well, I think we have to stick with what I ask you about with respect, because I don't have time to go with your agenda. And part of this is the airport scanners, which is, as you well know, a direct result of 9/11. So with that in mind, maybe you'd like to take that question.
On the airport scanners, well, you know, I'm giving a presentation in the Logan Park Hotel, and I'll touch them on them a little bit. And I have a lot of information on my website, and if people want information on that, they can go there. But I really do want to talk today about the economic crisis and what has happened in this country, if you'll allow me to.
I'd be delighted to, but can we just go one part at a time? And why don't you just quickly address the airport scanners?
The airport scanners, basically, I believe, are a gross violation of our privacy. And they give off terahertz ionizing radiation, kind of similar when you get an X-ray in a hospital. Now, if you notice that when anybody gets an X-ray, the doctors and the nurses move outside of the room, they get away from it. We Americans are expected to walk through these machines. And there's a professor emeritus of the University of California in Berkeley has stated that these machines can rip apart DNA and cause cancer. I don't believe that we need to be going through these. And what they're also doing in the US is subjecting people to these invasive body searches, basically groping people if they opt out, if they refuse to go through these scanners. I don't think it's necessary. I think security is necessary, all right, but I just think it's a step far too far.
Christopher Monckton, on climate change is your particular interest, as far as I can gather.
Yes.
And for most people we've heard about driving cars and burning coal and all these things that it seems are causing climate change and causing damage to the planet. Is that your contention?
What I'm saying is that it doesn't cause that much damage. Yes, there's a greenhouse effect. Yes, greenhouse gases exist. Yes, they cause warming. Yes, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Yes, we are responsible for quite a large increase in the concentration of that gas. And yes, we are causing some warming. All of that I concede, because it's common sense, it's well established. That is where there is indeed a scientific consensus, because large amounts of that have been scientifically proven. The question, which is where the scientific debate actually centres, in the peer-reviewed literature, which is where science is done, not in television studios, not in the newspapers. It's done in the peer-reviewed literature, and there are clearly two schools of thought. The climate modelers, who use their Xbox 360s and their PlayStations, and they play with numbers, which are very much detached from and often at odds with observed, measured reality, and those who try to work out the how much warming question by using measurement and observation. And it is those people who are largely concluding now in paper after paper in the peer-reviewed literature that the amount of warming you get by adding CO2 to the atmosphere is much less than the UN's climate panel and its supporters would have us believe.
Take, for example, the story in Australia of the flooding and so on. Really, the first place people go is climate change and global warming. They'll say this is all symptomatic of that. Would you buy that argument?
That is a very shrewd point that you make. That is what the Greens and the people who are exploiting this issue for various political and sometimes financial purposes will say. However, those particular floods in Brisbane, horrible though they were caused by a known phenomenon known as the La Nina phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, starting the other side of the Pacific and bringing that kind of weather. And it happens every 25 or 50 years. It last happened in 1974 when the floods were worse than they are now. And in 1974, we really weren't making that much difference to the climate. It happened twice in the 19th century, worse than it is today. So these are terrible events that don't come around all that often, but they have come around quite often before. So we know that they're natural, and we know that they're naturally caused. You may have noticed quite a lot of white global warming falling on your homes and streets this winter. That, too, doesn't either prove or disprove the theory of global warming.
Okay. Now,
and can I just wrap that point up?
Yes.
That is caused by what's known as a natural occurring blocking high, which also, similar events, caused the floods that were so dreadful in Pakistan and the forest fires in Russia. When you get these patterns of blocking highs that happen, often in conjunction with that La Nina, which has an effect all around the world, then you get these horrifying events, and they are known to be, and 2 or 3 recent papers have said this quite plainly, including one by NASA, they are known to be naturally caused and nothing to do with global warming.
Former Senator and Green Party member Deirdre Burke, good evening to you. Do you think that your previous party were just exploiting ecological scenarios for political gain?
Well, I'd like to respond to what Lord Monckton said, because obviously I come from a very different political background from him. I know he was a former political advisor to Margaret Thatcher, deputy leader of the UK Independence Party, Eurosceptic, committed Eurosceptic. I come from a different background, and I have to say, luckily we live in a liberal democracy. We are free to express our views publicly, but I think we do have a responsibility to think about the consequences of what we're saying publicly for people and for the societies we live in. And, you know, the climate change debate is a perfect example. The stakes are very high in the climate change debate because on the one hand you have mainstream scientific opinion represented by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which basically reflects the consensus view of the scientific community and says climate change is happening. It's happening quicker than we had anticipated. And even though it is a complex science and we can't explain it fully, what we can say, rather than looking at individual weather events, we can look at the underlying trends and say the climate is changing, and if it continues to change and human activities are making a significant contribution
so the facts
to that.
Are there that you're...
The question is this, though.
Lord Monckton,
how
if I could
much is... No, I think it's my turn now.
It is your turn.
How much is the climate changing? And here's the problem. If you look at the change in global average surface temperature, that's what we're talking about,
yep,
more than anything else, global average surface temperature. Between 1860 and 1880, it rose very rapidly at about 1.6 Celsius per century average equivalent. The same between 1910 and 1940. In both those periods, we could not have been the cause. Then exactly the same again between 1975 and 2001. Precisely the same rate of warming, and since 2001, no warming at all. So there has been no acceleration in the rate of warming. And without that acceleration, you can't make out that we're going to have a serious problem this century.
I have to say to you, you are absolutely spreading what I would call climate disinformation at the moment. 10 of the warmest years since we have begun to record global temperatures in the 1850s have been between 2000 and 2009. The warmest year on record, NASA has confirmed, was 2010, when we had a series of climate disasters, weather disasters. We had flooding in Pakistan, which covered 1/5 of the country. 20 million people were forced to leave their homes, and about 1,500 people lost their lives.
By natural causes.
We had flooding in Western India. We had flooding in China. We had 1,400 people killed due to landslides.
By natural causes.
We had heat waves in Russia.
We've already
which
covered
caused
this, madam. It's natural causes.
Heat-related deaths.
It's known to be, and in the scientific
all I can say to
literature
you, Lord
it
Monckton,
says
you
it's natural causes.
are not in agreement. The scientific establishment are very clearly saying that based on reviews of scientific studies that have been done since the IPCC began its work in 1988, saying human activities are responsible for the climate change that we are experiencing.
Why do you think somebody like Christopher Monckton would want to go around, like an evangelical person giving out disinformation? Why would somebody actively do such a thing?
Well, with all due respect, and this is just a point I would like to make, when you look at climate sceptics, or what are called climate deniers, they tend to be a small minority. They tend to be people who are not climate scientists, because actually the National Academy of Sciences...
Can I break in just for a moment? I was called a climate denier. That is a most offensive and objectionable term, madam. I ask you to withdraw it at once.
Well, Lord Monckton... Lord Monckton...
Just a sec. Now, why are you so offended by this?
Because that is a nasty implicit comparison with Holocaust deniers. It is unacceptable and is yet to be withdrawn, madam.
Deirdre.
Well, Lord Monckton, what I can say to you is that
withdraw.
You are, along with...
Withdraw.
You, along with Sarah Palin, is also a climate denier. And I stand over that. And what I'm saying to you, Lord Monckton,
is... refusing to withdraw.
I certainly won't. Lord Monckton, the implications of what you're saying is we can continue with business as usual. And it is more to do with support for a particular economic model that is very resistant to regulation, that's very resistant to the kind of legislation that's going to be necessary. In the UK, a climate change bill has been adopted. It's in law now since 2008 that sets legally binding targets for reducing emissions. And when we look at the implications for the human race, if we don't start to reduce the contribution that we're making to climate change, very, very serious for our economies and for human life.
May I come quickly back on that?
Right of reply to that.
Very good. Now, let's get one thing clear. When I gave you those figures for global temperature, they are figures which you will find in the IPCC documents, and I had a question put down in the House of Lords to get Her Majesty's government, authors of the climate change bill you speak of, to confirm that the figures I have just given you were correct before I came here to use them on the air. So I do not take it kindly, madam, when not only do you compare with me Holocaust deniers, but you also accuse me of giving wrong figures when you have not checked those figures, and I have.
Okay, well, by the way, you were the only person to mention Holocaust. It wasn't our contributor.
I know, but you know perfectly well, sir, that is the term that they use because that is the idea they have in mind, and therefore they should withdraw it.
Okay, I presume
but she won't withdraw it, will she?
Well, you don't. Do you want to withdraw it, Deirdre?
No, I called you a climate denier, and that is what I accept that you are.
We're not going to solve that here. And Harry Brown, you are a lecturer and a journalist and American background.
That's right, yeah.
And let's bring Jim Corr back into the argument, because I said that we would address some of the points that Jim made. So let's go back 2 steps to bring us forward, if you like. Listening to what Jim was saying, is he making sense? Is his argument valid for you?
I'm afraid he's not making sense, and I consider myself a skeptic about an awful lot of things. But when I listen to Jim, there's 2 ways that I really feel like these ideas need to be challenged. Maybe one is to take each of his arguments one by one and say, well, actually, you know what, the World Trade Center, there's 43 volumes on the physics and engineering of the collapse of the World Trade Center from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. If it weren't such a horrible event, it would be a most admirable piece of research and engineering, because it really is an extraordinary, complete and concise explanation, well, concise, maybe not the word, 10,000-page explanation of how those buildings came to fall in precisely the way they did. The science, the engineering, the understanding of the physics of the collapse of the World Trade Center is sound. There isn't a question about that. But I'd also like to talk about, if you like, the philosophical roots of what Jim is getting at, because I've spent some time on his website over the last couple of days, and the history of conspiracy theory in Europe and North America over the last century, what he called the Anglo-American shadow government, has its roots in, frankly, in anti-Semitism. I don't think Jim is anti-Semitic. I am not saying. I am not at all saying that Jim is anti-Semitic. I was on your website. I put the word Jewish into the search box on your website, and I came up with links to sites like The Ugly Truth and other sites that are clearly draw on the roots. I am not at all accusing you of anti-Semitism.
Would you clarify the connection between 9/11 and a Jewish conspiracy or an anti-Semite conspiracy?
Jim himself has suggested that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, was involved in 9/11. In fact,
I never mentioned Jews. You did.
You mentioned Mossad.
You should withdraw that.
You mentioned Mossad, Jim. Everybody heard you mention the Israeli intelligence agency. I'm no particular friend of Israel, and people who have heard me and seen me on other programs.
I consider Jewish people to be my brothers and sisters, okay? Well, as I do consider everybody to be my brothers and sisters, so how dare you, and you should withdraw that. Now, if I can take you up in your points, please. There are over 1,100 architects and engineers are telling us that those buildings could not have collapsed the way that we are told. We've got chemistry professors that have been able to positively identify this explosive substance in the dust from the World Trade Center. It's a controlled substance, highly sophisticated. You cannot make this in your garage. It can only be made in a laboratory. It's called nanothermite. A Danish chemistry professor called Niels Harrit led a group of eminent scientists. They were able to positively identify that stuff. There is no other reason for nanothermite being in the dust from the World Trade Center other than for controlled demolition purposes. This is what they're saying. Now, what does let me finish. What does nanothermite do?
You're attempting to blind us with science here, Jim. And to be honest, the science on the World Trade Center is really established.
Nanothermite cuts through steel like a hot knife through butter.
What I prefer to address, if you don't mind,
you can see the molten metal flowing out of the side of the building. How did that happen?
Okay, Jim,
what about the multiple explosions
you've had your
that were
moment
heard
there.
Now
by
listen,
the
Jim, the
first
burden
mentioned
of
that
proof
already.
is on people like you who say that we didn't see what we thought we saw. Planes flying into the towers collapsing as a result of the weakening of the structure after those planes crashed in. But let's again look at the larger question. You're imposing a kind of a master narrative on the financial crisis, on the World Trade Center, etc., that suggests that it's all the work of this shadow government. And I think that narrative, it may be appealing, but it's simplistic. It doesn't cope with the fact. I mean, you're suggesting essentially that people in the American government brought down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, essentially left little enough evidence that only a few of your friends have been able to find out what really happened. But meanwhile, they couldn't plant a few weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify their invasion of that country. You are overestimating the omnipotence of this cabal. My father was an activist in the United States in the 1960s in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. The FBI have a 1,200-page file on him. It's garbage. It looks like Abbott and Costello were following him around for several months. Of course, powerful elites do terrible, terrible things. Of course they do. Of course they conspire to do those things sometimes, but they also compete with each other. They fight among themselves. They screw up things a lot, as we know from what's been happening in this country.
Okay, I want to ask Christopher Monckton, do you just in one moment, if I may, do you concur with Jim Corr's belief on 9/11?
I'm afraid we must agree to disagree on that. I have worked, obviously, within Her Majesty's government as a very small cog in Margaret Thatcher's machine. It would be unthinkable that any member of the intelligence services would behave against the interests of his own country in such a fashion.
So you don't buy this argument?
Will you forgive me if very politely I disagree? I'm a great admirer of Jim's. I love his music. And if he would like me, I mean, the Corrs, they're very big in Scotland. You know, they first played as the backing group to Celine Dion in Glasgow all those years ago. I've followed this guy ever since, like a kind of stalker almost. I'm a great admirer of his. But on this particular matter, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to say, no, I'm not with him on that.
But have you researched it?
Now, he asked whether I've researched it. Now, the answer is no, I haven't, because I only research these things usually if it is in a commercial context, namely somebody pays me to go and do some digging. And so, Jim, with all the money you've made on your records, at my more than modest fee, I'll gladly look into it for you in the most professional way.
Okay, we have to leave it there, but I'll tell you what, I'll give you the last word on this, Jim.
I'd love to talk about the financial crisis. We've got people at home at the moment in this country that are
if you want to spend the last minute talking about that, please feel free to do so.
Oh, God.
I'm sorry, but this is the nature of the programme. We're live,
I just thought there was going to be a load of questions.
Alas, no.
Listen, in relation to the evidence of 9/11, if people can come along to the Slorgan Park Hotel, I'm going to make a presentation, a very strong presentation, I believe. I'm going to talk about the 60% of the 9/11 Commission members who have stated that the investigation was a fraud. And I mean, if that, sir, doesn't get you thinking, I don't know what will. And I mean, I'd love to talk about the financial crisis, because that's what I actually came here for.
Okay.
You know, if I can, just for a second. I want to talk about the bondholders that were bailed out by us, by the taxpayer. We bailed out 34 billion of taxpayers' money. Basically went to the likes of one of the richest families in the world, the Rothschilds. We also bailed out Goldman Sachs. Now, what we should have done was followed Iceland's example, where they burnt the bondholders. They're defaulting on their original debt. They said no to the EU and the IMF. And they're on the road to recovery. They're exiting the recession. Now, we have trillions of euros worth of oil and gas off the west coast of this country, which could solve our financial problems in a very short period of time, which corrupt ministers in our government gave away. We need to nationalise them.
You see, if you start doing that now, Jim, we don't know that because we haven't. I'll have to leave it there. But thank you for coming in to see us this evening.